Hey everybody, and welcome to the new normal as we start this process of moving everything online. Um, just to give you some idea of how this is going to work is my plan is that every Monday I am going to post a narrated PowerPoint like this, along with a quiz for you to answer. There may be some additional videos and things that I'll post, just depends on the topic. And Then at the end of the semester, we're not going to do the ServSafe certification because I have no idea whether or not we'll be able to meet in person. So the final exam will be a cumulative. It will not be the ServSafe exam. It'll be just like it, but it won't be the actual certification. And then I will uh, proctor the ServSafe for anyone who wants to take it after we've returned to campus. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's get going talking about whatever we're going to talk about today. Oh, we're going to talk about food safety management systems. And there are two types, and we'll get into that in a little more detail in just a second. So, what I mean by a food management safety system is this is what you should do as a manager to actively make sure that your facility is safe, to make sure that the food you serve is safe, and that all you're meeting all the guidelines. So this is the key word here is active, in that you are anticipating where problems might occur, and then you're getting ahead of it and preventing them from happening. The two types we're going to talk about are active managerial control and hazard analysis of critical control points. I'll tell you, on when you take the certification exam, they like this topic a lot, which makes sense because as a manager, this is where you're going to be spending your time. Okay, so both of these programs depend on the fact that you've got some stuff in place before you even begin with the more advanced idea of managerial control. So the things you have to have in place is you have to have a good personal hygiene program. You need to have your employees trained to wash their hands and when they need to do it. Uh, what the expectations are of them, what they can wear, clean uniforms, all those things need to be put in place before you start down this path. Another thing you need to have is you need to have a good system in place for selecting your supplier. The idea is that these programs don't work unless you have this sort of baseline in place. You can spend all your time as manager trying to make sure that things are safe and properly done. But if you are buying unsafe food, then all of it is for nothing. So you got to have a supplier selection uh, program in place. You have to have good sanitation and pest control in place. Your employees need to know how to wash the dishes, what temperature does it need to go at, how long does it need to sit in the sanitizer. They need to know all these things, and you need to have good pest control. You need to have a licensed pest control operator. We'll cover that later in the semester when we talk about what makes good pest control. But you can't have roaches and bugs and rats and mice and all those things running around. And then start worrying about, well, this is worrying about what you need to be focusing on as a manager. The first thing you need to be focusing on are these five things. You need to have good maintenance and proper equipment in place. Just again, you can't keep equipment sanitized if it's not properly maintained first. And the last thing is we're assuming you have a food safety training program in place. You are already teaching your employees how to be safe before you ever start down this path. Okay, so the first topic we're going to talk about is active managerial control. So with active managerial control, what we're looking at is the five most common things that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, um, focus on as the cause of most foodborne illness. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to focus your time as a manager on making sure you're buying food from safe sources. We are going to make sure that you are holding food at the correct temperature. Um, we're going to make sure you're cooking food to the correct temperature. We're going to make sure that you are not using contaminated equipment. And we're going to make sure that everyone is using good personal hygiene. And we're going to concentrate our effort on these things. For instance, talking about, well, I'll talk to it when we get to the slide. Now, the FDA has identified 5 things that we can do to control risks, or 5 places where we should spend our effort. That is, you should be able to demonstrate knowledge. This is why when you go in a restaurant, they will have their ServSafe certificate posted by the door. Why do you think that is? It's not that they're bragging. It's that the CDC has said, you know what, every restaurant should have someone on premise who can demonstrate knowledge of food safety. And so that's sort of the proof. We should pay attention to the health concerns of the staff, or the health of the staff. Especially right now, I find it kind of interesting with the way things are going in our current pandemic, that restaurants are continuing to provide takeout. Now, I understand from a business point of view, this is desirable and necessary, and also that restaurant employees typically have a higher level of food safety than people at home. But still, there is a certain amount of uncertainty, in that viruses can be spread via food, and so one of the things we want to concentrate on as a manager is just making sure that the staff is not infecting someone. Particularly, we talked about the staff, also the hands. This is where most of the contamination comes from, is that we have our hands become contaminated, we handle food, and then now we have contaminated the food. We spend a lot of time focusing on time and temperature. How long can something sit in the temperature danger zone? How hot does something have to be cooked to be safe? And then the last aspect of active managerial control, where the FDA has identified where we can provide an intervention for safety, is a consumer advisory. Think to almost any menu you've ever seen where it will say something to the effect of consumption of raw or undercooked food is potentially hazardous. That is on there for a reason. The idea is that we're making the public aware, yes, you can get your sunny side up eggs, but it does come at a risk. Okay, so here we go through the steps. Consider the 5 risk factors that we just talked about for food as it flows through your operation. You know what I mean by the flow of food. That is all the steps it takes from the time you order it till it ends up on the plate. So what we do is we look at the risk factors I just identified, and then we look for points where something could happen. Where am I handling the food? Where is there hand to food contact? If there is, what's my intervention there to make sure that it's safe? So the next one is create policies and procedures that address the issues we identified. So, like I just said, where do we have hand to food contact? Well, at those points, I need a policy, on hand washing or wearing gloves or anything that's going to make the food safer. And this is also a good point where you want to go and you want to ask your staff for suggestions. The person who's handling the food regularly day to day probably has a pretty good understanding of what you can and cannot do. So for instance, you can tell your staff, well, It's going to be necessary for you to thaw food under cold running water. And the staff may say, well, that's great. That's a fantastic way to do things, except we don't have enough sink space. So if you don't have enough sink space, what do you do? Well, then you're probably going to have to thaw things under refrigeration. I'm just giving you an instance of why talking to the staff is a good idea. Um, Then you want to monitor your policies and procedures. You want to just make sure that the employees are doing the steps that you've come up with as a way to provide safe food. And if they're not doing it, find out why. Is it that they're not able to, they don't have the equipment, or they weren't properly trained? Whatever it is, for whatever reason why they're not doing it, you address it and you fix it. Next step, you want to make sure that you're actually controlling the risk factors. Are you doing the things that are necessary to make sure that the food is safe? So you'll do things like internally, you can look at your records, like your temperature logs. How often do you check the temperature of the cooler? Are you doing it every 4 hours? How often are you taking temperatures on a buffet? How often are you going around and inspecting things? Those are internal records that you can use to make sure that you're controlling risk factors. And then the external things are things like customer comments. If your customers comment on something about your facility, of the cleanliness of it, or the quality of the food, those are things you should take into consideration. And also the health inspection reports, because the health inspector is there to provide guidance and to provide feedback to make sure that everything is done properly and safely. Okay, so now we'll go on to HACCP, and it's pronounced HACCP. And HACCP has an interesting history. It was actually developed by NASA, the Nestle Corporation, because they wanted to make sure that the astronauts, when they were in space, had food that was absolutely as safe as possible. Because if you're on Earth and you get a foodborne illness, you're going to be spending some time in the bathroom and be pretty unhappy. But if you're in space and you get a foodborne illness, well, there's no gravity, which means whatever comes out of you is going to be floating around in the environment. So it's really very dangerous and very unpleasant to have a foodborne illness in zero gravity. So NASA wanted to make sure that things were as safe as possible, so they developed HACCP. And so what HACCP is about is identifying those points or places where things are really likely to go wrong, and you focus your effort on those points. So it's called hazard analysis of critical control points. So that's it. I'm doing an analysis of hazardous places at the critical control points, the points where I can make a difference. Let's see. Oh, so another thing about HACCP plan is it is written down. You have a written document explaining the ins and outs of the specifics of your menu, your customers. If you have an at-risk population, for instance, your HACCP plan is dependent on the type of equipment you have. If I am boiling something on a stovetop, that's different than using a steam kettle, and so my plan needs to reflect that. And so your HACCP plan is unique to your operation. So even if you're working at two different restaurants in the same chain, you're working at two different McDonald's, they may have slight variations in equipment, and the hazardous analysis of critical control points plan is going to be unique to each one. So here are the 7 principles of HACCP. You'll need to know these. The ServSafe exam likes these, so you'll want to know them. So the first thing is conduct a hazard analysis. You're looking for where the problems are. Second, determine the critical control points. Where are the points where you can make a difference? Establish critical limits. At these critical control points, how much of something can happen before it gets dangerous? Each one of these 7 points has its own slide. I'll get into it in more detail. Establish monitoring procedures. Have a plan on how you're going to check to make sure that your critical limits aren't being exceeded. If your critical limits, if there's a problem at one of these points, what's your corrective action? How do you fix it? Sometimes the corrective action will be cook it more. Sometimes the corrective action will be throw it away. Then you want to verify that the system works. You want to monitor and see, hey, do I have less foodborne illness outbreaks than in the past? Do I have fewer instances of things of bad food? Just you want to monitor and make sure that it works. And part of that monitoring is the seventh step, which is record keeping plans. A HACCP plan provides documentation. This is important. If your health inspector ever shows up, if you have a problem, if you have an illness outbreak, heaven forbid, you can go to your plan and pull it out and say, here's the written documentation that explains my plan, and here are all the instances where I went through and monitored and measured and made sure everything was safe. So if you ever do, heaven forbid, have an outbreak, this is your defense, that you've done things that are reasonable to make sure that everyone is safe. Okay, so we'll go into a little more depth on these 7 points. The first one is conduct a hazard analysis. So if you look at the graphic down here, we have different types of food, and you can see the flow of food for the different types of items on the menu. And these represent points often where something can go wrong. So if I'm making a cold sandwich, well, one of the, I've got cold cuts, hand contamination of the meat is a problem. So that's something, there's a critical control point. When you assemble the sandwich, that's a point where something can go wrong. So what we want to do is we want to look at these items, and we want to look at each point where there can be a hazard. We want to look for biological hazards, chemical hazards, or physical hazards. So once we have started looking for hazards, then we're going to look at points where we can control things. So for a lot of food, especially that's, say a steak or meat or something like that, the critical control point is cooking. Because these are the points where the hazard can be prevented or eliminated or reduced to a safe level. And in your flow of food, there can be several critical control points. These are points that you'll monitor and where you can make a difference. So at these critical control points, we want to establish what's called a critical limit. And the limit either has to be met to prevent or eliminate the hazard or reduce it to a safe level. So for instance, in cooking, a critical limit is the temperature. If I'm cooking poultry, my critical limit is 165 degrees. So in cooking, if I cook a chicken or turkey to 165 degrees, it should be safe. That's the critical limit. If it's under the critical limit, it is not safe. Principle 4, we establish monitoring procedures. So we want to figure out how's the best way to make sure the critical limits are being met, make sure they're consistently being met, and then identify who's responsible for it. So if we use the critical control point again of cooking, well, the best way to check the critical limit is to take the temperature. So who's going to be responsible for taking the temperature? Well, if we're talking about cooking an item, probably the cook is going to be responsible for taking the temperature. If it is food sitting on a buffet and we've identified temperature as a critical limit, well, then it's probably going to be the person who's responsible for the buffet, maybe the server that's out there or a buffet attendant or someone. And then who's responsible for it and how often, and how will you monitor it? So how often? If we're talking about cooking, you're probably going to check the temperature every time you cook something. Every chicken breast, you should check the temperature of. If we're talking about a buffet, well, maybe we check the temperature every hour. And then we identify what corrective actions should be taken. So if I am cooking a chicken breast and it's 160 degrees, well, what's the corrective action? Well, the corrective action is cook it to 165 degrees. Put it back on the grill. Cook it some more. If we're talking about items on a buffet, we go out and we check the temperature and it's not hot enough to be on the buffet. It's not above 135 degrees. Well, what's corrective action? Well, I could reheat it. I can take it and I can warm it back up. Or I can take it off the buffet and throw it away. Or I can determine, well, it's been on the buffet for 30 minutes and the buffet closes in 2 hours. It will not exceed the 4 hour allotted time slot to sit in the temperature danger zone. So whatever it is, we identify these steps in advance of what we're going to do. Then we verify. So we keep records, and we go back and we check the records to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Are we taking temperatures? Are we monitoring our coolers? Are we doing all these things? And then we'll keep looking at hazards. Did we have a problem where someone did get sick? Or do we have an area that we're not addressing? And we go and we try and identify those hazards and fix the system. And then the last thing is have a policy for how you're going to keep your records. So do we keep, how long do we keep them? Where do we keep them? We're going to keep records of our temperature logs, our monitoring activities. We're going to keep a record of our corrective actions. Well, when temperature is at this range, this is our policy and what we do. We continue to cook the item until it reaches this point. We have our inspections of our equipment to make sure that it's in good working order. We have our orders with our suppliers, also our specs with our suppliers about how we expect our food to be handled before it comes to us. And if we do on-site inspections, we have those in there also. So that's HACCP. Now, a HACCP plan is required under a couple conditions. And so let's see, these conditions are things like smokes food as a method of preservation, but not to enhance flavor. If we use additives or components such as vinegar to preserve food, so it no longer requires time or temperature control for safety. If we cure food or we custom process animals. So if these sound familiar, these conditions when you need a HACCP plan, it's the same as when you get a variance, when you get permission to do something that's kind of outside the normal rules. So if you do any of these things, you're going to need a HACCP plan. You're going to need a HACCP plan if you do reduced oxygen packaging. You're going to need a HACCP plan if you pasteurize juice and then package it. If you have your own sprouts or bean sprouts that you sprout on site, you're going to need a HACCP plan. If you have a fish tank, or a lobster tank, any kind of live shellfish display, you're going to need a HACCP plan. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is crisis management. Kind of interesting in the current environment that we're in a giant crisis, but thankfully it really hasn't been foodborne related. But there are times when we deal with situations where things are food related. We need to have a plan in place. What you don't want is to be caught flat-footed. You don't want to be caught without a response. Now, it's not necessarily food safety related, but the best example I can give from a restaurant is how Wendy's responded when, and this is an older story than you guys were probably alive, but they had an instance where someone found a finger in their chili, a human finger. And Wendy's had a plan in place. They shut their stores down. They did an inspection of all their facilities. They talked to all their suppliers. They tracked everything. They suspended the sale of chili to try and find out what was going, where did this finger come from? How did this happen? They had press conferences. They had a single spokesperson who spoke for the company, who provided a single voice and a single story. It also later turned out that the thing was a scam, that the person who had found the finger was just trying to get money from from Wendy's. But Wendy's had a short-term loss, but they handled the problem very well, and they recovered completely. And it's because they had a crisis management team in place. They had a program or a plan in place. So what do you need for your crisis management program? You need a team. Who is going to be responsible? You need to prepare for different types of crises. You need to have a specific written plan that someone can pull out, because you never know when the crisis is going to happen. So you're the manager, you have a plan in place, you know what to do. Well, you're on vacation when suddenly there's an outbreak, and your assistant manager has to handle things. Well, he or she needs to have a plan they can go to know what to do. And then you need to kind of have a run through of your plan and practice it. So your crisis management plan should focus on three things: preparation, response, and recovery. Preparation: we're not going to get caught flat-footed. We're going to have a written plan. We're going to train everybody on it. We're going to be ready to go. Your response: in the moment, how do you deal with it? And then recovery: after it happens, how do we get back to business as normal? So some of the preparing for an outbreak, in our crisis management, we want to train our staff on food safety. Just have everybody ready. The best way to deal with this is prevention. Have a report form. If someone comes in and, if a guest, heaven forbid, has become ill, have a standard policy in place on how you deal with it. So, just a minute, let me get a form. I will take your report, and we will act on it immediately. Create an emergency contact list. Who do you call if something goes wrong? Who's going to be on that list? Is it the manager? Is it the owner? Is it going to be your attorney? Who is it going to be? Your supplier? Who are you going to contact in the event of an emergency? And then develop a crisis communication plan. How are you going to communicate with the people that are involved, the managers, owners, the various players, and who is going to be the spokesperson? The best way to deal with a crisis is to have a single voice out there speaking. What you don't want is, the news comes and they're, heaven forbid, you have a news crew at your restaurant, and they're interviewing people, and they start talking to the servers, and the servers, they don't have good information yet, and so now that story's getting out. What you need is a single person who's responsible to provide communication. How's that going to happen? So here are some guidelines. If a customer calls to report a foodborne illness, then things you should do: express concern, but don't admit responsibility. I'm not saying lie, but you can use the thing of, that's terrible. It's terrible that happened to you. Let me take a report so we can start acting on this. What you don't say is, wow, that's entirely our fault, because then you're opening yourself up for liability. So you don't admit responsibility until you have the facts. I'm not saying you deny it, but what I'm saying is, if a customer is calling, you don't have all the facts yet. You don't know what has happened. And we have to keep in mind the way foodborne illnesses happen is, say, particularly with things like bacterial infections, is they can take 36 hours, 72 hours to manifest. In the case of hepatitis, up to 6 weeks to manifest, maybe more. So you don't want to admit responsibility, because the thing that they think made them ill, that hamburger they ate 4 hours ago, may not be the thing that made them ill. It may be the apple pie they had 2 days ago, and now it's making them sick. So you don't admit responsibility. Fill out your event form, and then look to see if there's similar complaints. What you want to do is you want to look for a pattern. One person being sick, that's really hard to establish that, what the cause is. But if you have 5, 6, 7 people getting sick from eating the same thing, or even 2 people getting sick from eating the same thing, then that's something you really, really want to look at carefully. If there are similar complaints, then you call the crisis management team. When you get multiple people complaining of the same thing, it starts to look like there's an outbreak. That's when you call in the crisis management team. You call in everybody that's involved in your response, and start figuring out what you're going to do. Identify if there's a common food item. The people who are reporting similar illnesses, Did they all eat the same thing? If they all ate the same thing, like, you had made lasagnas a special, and they all ate the same lasagna, well, that's pretty easy to identify. Um, but start, if it's not that simple, start looking for common ingredients. Or all the people that are complaining of being ill, did they all, was it all made with chicken stock? They had, some of them had chicken soup, some of them had rice, some of them had another dish, but they all have this common ingredient. Well, again, you can start using that to narrow down what the source is. And if you have, several complaints that are similar, contact the health department. It is their job to make sure that people are safe, and their job is to help track this down, help track down the people that are involved, to try and identify causes. So if you have um, several complaints of foodborne illness together, grouping like that, contact the health department. If the food is still in the operation, so let's say that you have people who have become ill, and it's an item that you still have. You still have that box of chicken. You still have that quart of stock, whatever it is. Isolate it. So you take it so that it can't be sold. If it's one of those things where the customers have become ill, if they still have the food, like if it was at a takeout item, for instance, or something like that, if they still have it, get a sample if you can. It's fairly unlikely, doesn't happen that often. But back to the isolate thing, you want to pull the item away from the rest of the food. You want to ensure that it can't be used to make anything else. It can't be sold to a guest. What you're doing is you're holding on to it until the health officials can get there and look at it, and maybe send it in for analysis or identify that it's the cause. So if you can if you can identify the food, isolate it so it can't be sold. If the outbreak is caused by a staff member, or you suspect it is, the people who were complaining that they became ill all had the same server. Well, exclude that staff member from the operation until you can get to the source of the problem. If the regulatory authority, if the health inspector, the health department, whoever you're dealing with, confirms that you are the common cause in the outbreak, then cooperate with the official to resolve the crisis. So maybe that you end up being closed for a day while they do an inspection and look for a source, or maybe they're going to tell you you're going to have to change this piece of equipment. Whatever it is, you cooperate with the authority to solve the crisis. If the media shows up, follow your crisis communication plan. Who's going to talk to them? Who's going to be your spokesperson? You let them handle the communications. So, recovery. How do we recover from a foodborne illness outbreak? You work with the authorities. You work with the health department. You don't fight them, basically because they can pull your permit. You work with them to resolve the issue, to make sure that the food is safe, and that people are given safe food, that everything's safe for your customer. You clean and sanitize everything so that it doesn't happen again. You throw out the suspected food you've set it aside. The health inspector or the health department has looked at it, and then you throw it away. You find out what the cause of the outbreak was. You go through and you look for the reason. Why did this happen? Then you establish procedures to prevent it from happening again. And then figure out how you're going to talk to your customers to let them know that the food is safe.